Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Just to let you know, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. There's a little bit of time if you need to get a beverage at the bar, use the restroom, do anything like that, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thanks for being here. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this cold, smells like snow evening. My name is Lauren Medici. I'm the Director of Engagement Programs here at Opera Omaha, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to our second Opera in Conversation for Suor Angelica here at the Benson Theater. I'm joined on stage by our wonderful panelists. You have bio sheets in front of you, so I will not read their full bios, but I'll briefly introduce them, and we'll dive right into conversation. After we do that, I just want to clarify, this is Opera in Conversation. Participation is encouraged. We are live streaming, and so we'll turn over to questions at a point in the program, and Pat will come and grab a mic and walk around to take questions. I just ask that you wait till the mic gets to you so that your question can also be captured for the live stream, and we can make sure everybody can hear. So you'll know when question time is happening, so save those on up. So I am joined on stage by Joe Giles, who is with the Omaha Women's Fund, Dr. Catherine Medici-Thiemann, who is with UNMC, and Peggy Jones, who is a professor at UNO in the theater department, and also with Women and Gender Studies. So, without further ado, we'll get our conversation started. Thanks for that. We've never gotten applause there before. That's exciting. So, the motivation for this panel and conversation, as we knew we were doing Suor Angelica, we knew we would be planning in what world we're planning to present Suor Angelica in, was really diving into the fact that Suor Angelica, at the end of the day, is a story about a woman being able to have power to choose her own life, to choose her own destiny, to make her own choices in that sort of way, which, as if you were part of Opera in Conversation last week, or have seen it on our YouTube channel, our director, Katora, says is really central to not only the story of Suor Angelica, but our lives right now. So I couldn't think of anything better and better people to be up here on stage with me than working with the Omaha Women's Fund and UNMC and UNO to really explore what that looks like. So when we were starting this conversation, we really centered on this idea of agency, and that's the title of our conversation, is Women Agency and Empowerment. So to start with, I'd love to turn over to our panel and talk about what does women's agency mean? It's a really, it's a big topic, but what does that start with and mean? And Joe, I'm gonna ask you to start there.
Sure, thank you. From the Women's Fund perspective, one of our values is bodily autonomy. And what that means for us is this idea that every person has the opportunity and deserves the opportunity to decide what they will do with their own body, and that is their right, and that we work as the Women's Fund to protect that right. And so bodily autonomy, bodily empowerment is so key to our work and key to our overall mission to ensure that every woman and girl has the opportunity to reach their full potential. So you can imagine that bodily autonomy is a center to our core mission, and that extends to our advocacy work, which is so important even in this moment. We are collectively fighting with our coalition partners a very dangerous bill that's been introduced in our legislature this session, which would ban abortion at the 6-week mark, which is before many women even know that they're pregnant. So that relates to this idea of bodily autonomy and how and when people choose to be parents. So that relates very closely to this play and Angelica's decision that her family makes for her, as we see further along in the play. So I'll turn it over to our other panelists.
I think one thing that's really important about agency is that sometimes we think that only big, showy aspects of decision making and for example, political agency are valuable. But that is not the case, and as a historian, a lot of the work that we have been doing in my field has been to try and find those moments of agency where women are making decisions and also moving things forward and making changes happen that have often been overlooked because they don't resemble what we expect agency to look like. So thinking about where can people exhibit choice and power in their lives and in their communities is really important to look at.
And for for myself, what jumped to my mind was the Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins, and when she talks about in her writing and work about that slippery slope from protect to control. And with women's lives, things can often be presented as, we're just trying to help you, we're trying to protect you. But notwithstanding the kind of insulting nature of I need protection, but rather that it could easily slide to control and decision making, as we saw, or as we will see in Suor Angelica, and with many, many, many women, decisions that get made on a societal level that say, we just can't stand to see our women killed in combat, so we'll take that opportunity from them without them getting to assert whether they would like it or not. So agency is often, as the panelists, my panelists have said, it can be subverted in so many ways and even kind of represented or mispresented as, oh, it's just, we're just trying to help and we're just trying to be there to take care of them, and leaving out that crucial step of, well, what do you want? How do you want to live in the world today?
Thank you all for starting that space. I have 2 pages of notes, so we're going to keep it short, I promise. But I really want to, going into this idea of having a choice about how you live your life and what you do, one of the things we have talked about is this whole opera takes place in a convent. And for some women, that setting of a convent could be really a positive environment. Puccini had a sister who was a nun, who he was really close with, and this opera isn't an indictment of the church as much as it is about the Suor Angelica's family that makes this choice for her to be there. Catherine, can you talk a little bit about what that is in that idea of freedom within a convent, kind of historically in that setting, and all centered around if you made the choice to enter a convent?
Sure. So this opera takes place in a post-Trinitine convent, which means the Catholic Church made a bunch of rules after the Restoration because, the Reformation. We're talking about Europe, not England. And they basically said, yeah, maybe the Protestants have some good points, so we got to fix some things. And what that means is they first stricter enclosure for convents and made convents a space that was much more separate from the world than they had been before. So if you have a traditional image of a convent, like perhaps you saw The Sound of Music on television, one of the many times it's been aired, and you see the grills in the convent, those grills are something that comes out of this to physically separate nuns from the world. And so within these spaces, you have spaces that are very much run by women who are making the choices and deciding how things happen on a day-to-day basis within the convent. And so you get a lot of power in that position. Convents also could be large landholders, because when women came into the convent, they brought a smaller version of a dowry, which often included land or money. And so as today, land and money gives you influence. And so convents could be large landholders and also in control of fairly wealthy sums of money. And there were women who were in charge of those things. So that gave them a lot of influence.
Great. Peggy, I want to go back to your comment and thinking about that slippery slope, right, between protection and control. And in the opera, Suor Angelica is forced to enter the convent by her family, I'm sure with the language surrounding that of this will be good for you, or it will be good for us. So I want to think a little bit more about that idea of power and control, and one of the things of how we make those decisions about what's good. What's a good place to be as a woman? What's the right place to be as a woman, and how that gets portrayed in art and media?
Yeah, thank you. I think in kind of dovetailing from what was just what you were talking about with a religious setting and that control and where you're sitting, we had a very interesting conversation as we were preparing for this, where we're not wanting anyone to think that and as it happens in the opera, women chose to be there. They chose to, just like women will choose to wear certain attires, certain head coverings. They're making their faith visible. They're shielding themselves affirmatively. They're not being told, you must do this, but they're making those choices. But as we see in the opera, as we see in life, excuse me, there are many instances where you're doing this for your family. We're going to look bad because you had this child out of wedlock. you didn't take the steps you were supposed to take, and therefore you need to be put out of society, out of our, society, even though you've got this wealth, theoretically this wealth, and you're going to have to give it up to your sister who did what she was supposed to do, and I think getting back to that power and control, or protecting rather to control, is it becomes an issue where you might have multiple things pulling at you, but in this case, we don't even get the option of choosing what things are going to happen. She doesn't get the option, Angelica doesn't, of choosing, but rather it is foisted upon her, both being in the convent and having her child taken, and so she doesn't get to be the mom she wants to be, and she doesn't even have she's told you must give up the wherewithal she could have had to have a very great life for herself and her child. And so I think that in that kind of notion of protecting, leading, controlling, the challenge becomes, is the woman exerting the control of what she wants to be doing to empowering, versus that external control that says, it doesn't matter what you want. It matters what makes us look good. It matters what people expect of us, what we expect us to put out in the world with our family. So I think that it's just very challenging when, to this very contemporary day that we're in now, that women are seen as, you can't make decisions for yourself. You're not capable of doing it, is what it says by default. If you say we're going to pass laws that say this, it means we don't trust you to have the control to do what you wish with your life. We're going to tell you what to do. And that's just, it's both galling, but it's also very, to me, and I think many it's saddening, because it's presented as, well, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what makes you a good woman, and to be worthy of, being treated a certain way.
And that's the reproductive justice framework, is that women should be allowed to decide if, when, and how they want to parent. And in Angelica's case, she wants to have this child. She wants to be a single mom, and that decision is taken from her by her own family. And that is what we're dealing with even today, is that there are people who want to decide if they want to parent, if they don't want to parent, if they want to be the best aunt in the world, if they want to be a single parent, or if they don't want to have children, or they want to have 10 children. I mean, it should be up to each individual to make the best decision for themselves.
I would love you to speak a little bit more about that, Joe, and how there are multiple elements that the Women's Fund advocates for or is thinking about, and what that means in that way, because I know from your website, which if you haven't seen it, it's fabulous in terms of, if you want to know what's going on in the legislative session right now in Nebraska, Women's Fund website has all of these things. But your information on your website is not just about that one bill, it's about all of these different elements that would help someone parent in the way that they want to parent. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've realized is, to create real lasting change, we need to dig deeper and look at the systems that impact all of us. And one of those systems is the legislature and local government, right? So we have dived deeply into policy, and so we have a list of all of the bills that we are working on this legislative session. So our website is omahawomensfund.org, so O-R-G, and we have a page called Be an Advocate. So it kind of walks you through how to find your state senator in Lincoln, how to send an email, how to call them, just tips on how to make that connection and what to say, because many of us don't even know how to get involved in the process. And then we have fact sheets on the different bills that are important to us. And we really engage on issues that are core to our mission, such as gender-based violence. So for example, one of the bills that we're working on in that area is, let's see, we've got so many, so I'm trying to pick one of them that might make the most sense. Okay, so one of them is working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So one of the things that happens to survivors is if they go and get treated for medical care after their assault, those medical bills can be sent to debt collectors. So now you're in a situation where you've had this traumatic thing happen to you, you've received medical care, and then all of a sudden you get a bill and you're getting called from a debt collector. So now you're reliving that trauma again. So there is a fund that the legislature set up that's called the Crime Victims Reparations Fund, that those bills should automatically go to that fund to be paid for. Well, that's not what's happening. It's going to a debt collector. So we introduced a bill to rework that system so it actually goes to where the legislature intended. So it seems like a quick fix, right? But those are the sorts of things that we're seeing when we listen to survivors, that's happening, so we want to fix those so it's working better for survivors. So that's an example of the type of work that we're doing. Other types of bills that we're working on this session are increasing child care affordability, increasing families. So all of the things, economic justice, reproductive justice, gender-based violence, all fall within the overall goal of the Women's Fund, which is to ensure that women and families have the opportunity to reach their full potential. And so all of that is interconnected with our work.
Thanks for diving into that and giving those great examples. I really appreciate it. I would love to talk about one of the things that came up while we were having our conversation in advance of this, is this idea of what is explicit, and we've talked about it a little bit in terms of systems and things that you might make connections to, and what's implicit in terms of that definition of what makes a good woman, who enforces that, who defines that, how do we see it in our world in both explicit and implicit ways. So I'll put this to who wants to start on there.
Peggy.
Well, I think there are so many like sayings about like we feel like the sexism around us is like the water to a fish. It's like it's just there. We don't even really see it. We don't notice it. We see it in the language that gets used in media. We see it in images that get presented. We even see it in like how relationships are described. And so, and I think what makes it, or what additionally is so challenging with that, with the messages about being a good woman, being a woman worthy of, et cetera, is how much that gets controlled, policed by other women. And they aren't necessarily coming out of spaces, those other women aren't coming from places where they've been raised to reach their potential and to do what they want and to make choices. It could well be that it's a perpetuation of like an internalized sexism. And that sexism is saying, you're not as good as, you don't really, let me tell you what you need to do with yourself. Trust me to make these decisions, whether I and the speaker is the laws or, a heteropatriarchal family structure or something like that. So I think that it always amazes me at times, but it shouldn't, but it does amaze me when I see women and people, kind of not seeing how things are so set up in systems that kind of replicate one group getting this privilege and power and another group like not getting that, even when we know, when this was something that came up in our conversation, how much better everything is when there's a diversity of views, a diversity of mindset and approaches to problem solving. So it truly would make everybody better if there were an openness. So that really, it throws into question like how are certain things still reinforced? And it's because in part, that's how we've always done it. You'll hear people say, or that's what feels right to me. That's what feels natural to me. And so it doesn't get interrogated. It doesn't get critiqued. It just gets accepted. And the challenge is kind of when can we find opportunities to kind of open lift up the blinds or open the door, or, you know, get more light on a situation and say, oh, well, why do you think that is? You know, it could be as simple as just asking that question. It doesn't have to be accusatory. It doesn't have to be, you know, adversarial. It can just be, I'm curious, why do you think that is? Because otherwise, we just keep reinforcing those same implicit control structures that are there.
I see this a lot with the students I work with. You know, no one is explicitly saying that women don't make as good of doctors, or women shouldn't be going into medicine, but they are definitely getting messages that you can't be a good doctor and a good parent. You're going to have to make a choice. They're, you know, being told in 1,000 little ways that to be professional is to dress like an older white man. Like literally, that we have dress codes about nail color in some of our schools, like at UNMC, not like high schoolers. And, you know, what is that saying about what is professional? Because it's kind of saying like, oh, if you have long, pink, glittery fingernails, that's not professional. Well, that's also saying like, to be feminine is not to be professional, and that's a problem. So these are kind of the things we see coming through. Every year I have students who all of a sudden realize that now that they're taking a women gender studies class, the deep problems with dress codes in their high school and how we enforce dress codes, because that very much says like what is a good female student, or you know, what is a good teenage girl to be, and if you're going against the dress code, you're not a good girl. So I think, you know, we see it in a lot of different ways.
And a lot of industries that those systems were just not built for women. I have friends who are lawyers and who will talk about the dress code in the legal industry, and even how billing works, and the struggles that they've had in terms of balancing their career and family, and the billing challenges that are involved in that. And you just look at industry work for women because it wasn't built for that, and it wasn't built to accommodate parents who want to do both. So there's a lot of patriarchal systems that we try to disrupt at the Women's Fund.
And
So,
can I just throw in one quick sad, funny story where a friend of mine who works at the Med Center was visiting with one of her friends who's a woman who's a surgeon at the Med Center, and they kept getting these messages from a patient saying, when are we going to get to see our surgeon? When are we going to get to see our surgeon? And they're like, you've seen your surgeon a few times before and after the surgery. Turned out they thought that the surgeon that they'd been seeing, their surgeon, was a nurse and couldn't be their surgeon. And the worst part of this story is it was like National Women's Surgery Week or something like that. So it really sadly goes to like, yeah, days or weeks that honor things can be important, but it's hard to really overcome. I mean, this male patient was infuriated that he had not seen his surgeon. And when the surgeon came in and said, I've heard you've been upset, and they were like, well, yeah, we've seen you, but where's our surgeon? It's like, I'm your surgeon. What? You know, so I think when it's just that ingrained, you know, that tells us how far we have to go.
So I want to go this idea about systems. When we start talking about systems, this opera is set in kind of the late 40s, kind of immediately following World War II. In theory, it's set in Italy, but we're going to talk about what that time frame was. We're going to be a little creative and talk about what that time frame was in the United States, and there's a really interesting space about how a lot of the systems we're talking about now kind of were created in that time frame. I'm going to ask Catherine, our historian.
Yeah, so interesting time period because of the need to get women into the workforce during World War II, to produce things for the war and work in factories where men who had gone off to fight were working. We saw a lot of shifting of traditional gender roles, and there was actually systems that had to be put in place to support working women, like federally government-supported childcare. And then all the men came back from the war, and they were like, okay, so we'd like our jobs back. And women were very much pushed out of the workforce by policies and laws, and like just be like, okay, great, thank you for your service during this difficult time, and please go back to your home, regardless of what that looks like for you. And a lot of policies were put in place to reinforce this ideal of men work and women should be in the home and take care of children. And so we see this in urban design, in which we pushed families out into the suburbs so that women were physically separated from the place that money-making work occurs. They're further isolated by car culture, and we discourage them from working anywhere legally because we are allowed to discriminate in hiring by gender. But we also put into place these kind of, what we often call the American dream of like the house and the 2 children and the picket fence. And, mom staying at home and raising the kids. And so we very much limited other types of lives for women, even though that wasn't actually possible for many families to survive on a single salary, or there are many women-led families. And so policies were put in place that reinforced this, that emphasized it, and discouraged any other type of life.
Peggy, can you talk a little bit about what you shared when we first started talking about this, about the dichotomy and how that impacted all women?
Yeah, because what we see is a very strong intersectionality occurring with race, with gender, in terms of this is the messaging that white women got, and women of middle class and higher, and for them to, in some instances, for them to live the life, they had help come in, which meant another woman wasn't able, her choices were limited on if she wanted to, whether she wanted to work in different ways or work with or stay with her family. She wasn't given kind of that option, as Catherine mentioned, as far as like that dual salary role, or the dual salary. It was very difficult to survive on a dual salary, but just the notion that how much other women's labor has an impact in the systems that was set up post World War II, and what it meant for those families and their lives. We see, as time goes along, and we see like these reports being done about like black families in the Moynihan Report in the 60s, like, oh, look at how these matriarchs are just ruining the family and blah, blah. I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic how much the complete like dismissal of what labor in the home is worth, as well as for the women, mostly white, but other women of other backgrounds, who had gone to college, who had gotten educated, who had been out in the world in the public sphere and been told, nope, get back to the private sphere. You did what we needed you then. And that happens historically throughout our history in the United States, where if a group is doing, a group gets pulled up to do something for the benefit and then gets told, I'll get out. And we don't need you, we don't want you, and if anything, you're a threat. And so I think it's just very, as we've said, it's instead of a system that could benefit everyone and that could give so many, to reach their potential, to reach their strongest desires, it's just kind of amazing. And what I've been thinking about is, in my family, there were 7 kids, and we were always so happy that mom worked as well as dad, because when mom came home from like on payday, it was like, ooh, special treats, as well as, you know, I didn't know we were latchkey kids until I saw it on 60 Minutes, that that I had to wear a key to let myself in. But I think it's interesting when I think of the women that came in our home to help with things, with babysitting, with housekeeping, et cetera. And I don't really remember what kind of family life they had. And I can't ask my mom because she's passed, but I think I will reach out to my siblings who were around then just to find out, like, were they childless, or did they have kids? Like, as I'm thinking back, it's like, I don't know if they actually had their children in their homes at the time. I also remember that my mom would always make sure, and I'm sure Dad agreed, that we would never call these women by their first name. We would always call them Miss or Mrs. so-and-so. And so it's just really interesting that, to me, when I think about some of these issues with like how women are in the world, but I started to say, and I interrupted myself, we were grateful that our mother was out in the world, because if she'd have stayed home, oh my gosh, that would not have been good. She had a lot of, we would have just been like, oh, she just doesn't stop. And I mean, it would have just not been, nobody would have been happy. We were all happier for this. But yeah, suffice to say, and I think her being a teacher helped a lot too. She got a lot of that mothering out on other kids as well. But all her kids are really successful, la la la. But suffice to say, you know, it's just really interesting when you have those models, though, versus not having them, I think is another big piece.
But that's the agency piece too,
Yeah.
is that women should be able to decide if they want to be in the home, if they want to be a chef, if they want to be an airline pilot, if they want to change their mind next week and be a teacher or an educator. I mean, that's the whole point of it.
Exactly.
And someone else is deciding, whether that be the government or their spouse, that no, you don't have the right to do that. You need to only go back to this one suburban model. And that's, I think, where a lot of the frustration is coming from.
And like two of the most, I mean, second wave feminism very much draws out of this frustration of not having options. Mm-hmm. And we see that in Betty Friedan's work, The Feminine Mystique, but also Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex is also written at this time, which, by the way, also argues about the oppression of childcare and not having support for childcare. And I always, when I read these things with my students, I'm like, what does it say? That we're still having this argument. And this was written in the late 40s.
And we're still having that argument now.
Yes, exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
And we think about what happened during COVID, which in the legislature, the bill that was passed that we're trying to extend was the eligibility requirement for individuals. There's a cutoff point. So if you make just a little bit extra money, the safety net falls apart for you. And so you no longer get assistance with paying for childcare, which is ridiculously expensive if you have an infant or a young child in care. So the bill that we're trying this legislature is to extend the eligibility for families for 3 more years so we can get enough data from the state to show that yes, this program is working in Nebraska, and yes, we need to keep the eligibility where it is so that more families have access to childcare.
I think that, you know, in really thinking about all of these things that you're saying, that goes into this idea of reproductive justice, of having kids and being able, the choice to have kids or not have kids, or to parent or not parent in the way that you want, with the supports and systems in place to do that. I think about, you know, Suor Angelica wanted to keep her child. She wanted to be a single mom. She did not have the support of her family or a society in order to do that. You know, and how different would her life have been, but so many lives have been, if they felt like that was a choice that they could make and be supported and be able to thrive.
And especially in that situation where it wasn't that our family said, we can't afford to help you be this mom you want to be. It's like, we more than can afford this. This would be not even a crunch for us. And yet and still it was this societal / you know, what will people say, what will people think, This is not who we are, how we want to be seen. But just, so of course it adds to the tragedy of it, that they could have easily done that, versus those who desperately need that safety net, that need that support. And that safety net lives out the rhetoric that we hear all the time. Oh, we care about children, it's like, well, put your money where your mouth is if you really care about human beings, but it's kind of not looking like you're caring if you're not doing these basic things.
I think it's emblematic that, so in society at the time that Suor Angelica takes place, there is not a place for unmarried women who are not going to be married, are very stressful. We don't really have a good place for them. You need to be a maid, so you need to be pre-marriage and kind of young, or you need to be married, or you can be a widow, but you should be an old widow, because young widows are very stressful to us, because they're not under control of men. So, and there's absolutely not a space for a young single mother. Like, we don't have a way to understand that, and we like to put people in boxes, and that doesn't fit in our box for women, so we don't know what to do with that. Our society is still not really built for people to be single parents. Our system is still really built for a two-parent household. I used to think of this a lot when I lived across the street from an elementary school, and I saw the pickup line at 3 o'clock, and I was like, who can pick up their kids at 3 o'clock and have a job? Like, this very much depends on having a parent that is not working a regular 9-to-5 job. And also it really was a problem for traffic. But, like, I used to think about, like, that's just a very visual indication that we as a society are not set up for two working parents. And when I say not set up for two working parents, what we really generally mean is we're not set up for women to work. So that's a problem.
And there's a snow day tomorrow for all of us.
They already called, yeah.
For everybody being worried about childcare, speaking of how that's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've talked a lot about what the situation is in the opera and how it relates to now and what's happening, and we've talked a lot about agency, and I want to talk a little bit about the other half of this title, of empowerment, right? So what can we do? What actions can we take to move and work against these barriers and make some positive change?
Well, I think one thing, I'll say two things. One is, I think having this conversation is a great step towards that, because the more awareness that we can have to think about agency and empowerment, and the more that we in this room and in the live stream room can think about agency and empowerment and really examine the role in which we ourselves continue the systems that we've been raised in. We've all been raised in a patriarchal system, and the more that we think about that and find ways to deconstruct our own thinking is helpful. From an advocacy standpoint, I would just encourage everyone to, again, go to our website, omahawomensfund.org, and look for our Be an Advocate page, and connect with us on social media to see how you can engage in the process of just letting your voice be heard. Find the issues that you care about and engage from a grassroots perspective and talking to your elected officials about the ways in which you feel about these issues and see how they're all connected. Because when any group is marginalized, when any group does not have the ability to reach their full potential, we all suffer as a community.
Yeah, I think a lot of times just kind of speaking out, it's really powerful when people realize that the issue that they're facing is not a them issue, but a structural issue and a bigger problem. And, this happens a lot with my students. They all of a sudden realize after reading stuff like, oh, what I experienced was inappropriate sexual violence and not like something that just happened to me because I made some bad choices in high school. And so talking about those things, talking to other people about what they're facing and making a decision that, like, you know, this situation really sucked for me and I want to make it better for others. You know, I work with our pregnant and parenting students, and right now what I'm saying is, you know, we don't necessarily have great systems in place, but I think you're talking to me because you know, may have what you experienced was difficult and you don't want other people to experience that. So we want to make it better for those going through this later. And so, you know, talking to people about it, talking to others, and saying, hey, this is a problem, is really important.
I think moving, maybe pointing out and trying to move past the idea of power being a zero-sum game. If I have it, you don't. If you have it, I don't. Especially when it comes to gender and gender equity, because we are all interconnected. We are mutually connected. We have this, you know, but if we fall victim to, or fall like be enthralled by the sound bites that say, well, if I have this, you don't have that, you know, and it's, you know, and it's almost kind of blatantly said that way. It really helps us not see how we are connected and how these things, you know, can help all of us, as was just said, you know, when any of us are suffering, we're all going to suffer as a group. And so, as I said earlier too, just when having conversations and discovering someone is feeling rather, you know, well, I don't know who in the right mind would think that a child doesn't do better when they're raised at home with their mom, you know, and just to say, oh, that's interesting, why do you think that? And just really try to, you know, shush out the details versus you're crazy, that's wrong, but not just adversarially push back or even start debating, but just listening. Because I think otherwise we're not going to make any real progress if we don't listen to those who are asserting things that we kind of know via data and all kinds of things that they aren't really true. But if someone is feeling they're true, there's a lot of research out there that tells us the more you tell someone what they believe isn't true, they're going to hold on to it that much stronger. But if you can listen to why they're saying it and kind of get to, you know, how, you know, like, oh, could you tell me how you're raised? I mean, and assuming, again, it's someone who you're in a relationship with, that you can have that conversation. And maybe it's a way to deepen a relationship you already have. But I think those are ways that we can be a part of the solution to these challenges that we have.
Awesome. I also want to call out, I think Joe was the one who said this, is part of this is having this conversation, but also having conversations with others and surrounding yourself with people who also believe in empowering women and girls, and building those networks and connections in those sort of way is also really important in that space. So you're all here for this conversation, so that would indicate you might have interest in it. So I'm just saying, you might have already started some of those connections. So at this time in the conversation, Pat's gonna come up and grab my mic, and he'll be in the audience so we can take your questions.
If you have questions, you can just raise your hand and I will come to you.
We did such a great job. We answered questions they didn't even know they had. Oh, there's a hand.
Perfect.
One of the things I struggle with is how to talk to a fellow female who maybe is saying something that I think is problematic. And do you have any advice for that?
Can you give us an example?
I can't think of one off the top of my head, but yeah, so I'm sorry about that.
Do you think, I mean, I'm wondering, is it something where, kind of like I was just saying, where, wow, that's interesting, could you tell me more about that? Or to try to draw out? I know though, sometimes, if it's problematic to the point where like, yeah, I kind of want to punch somebody. I mean, that's maybe just me. But if you are in a state, or you're not in a state where you can just kind of maybe like do some inquiry, or if not then, maybe later. I mean, it would depend on the relationship, obviously, but I think that's even, studies tell us that as much as we may want to counter something with, well, here's the reality, or here's why you're wrong, or here's what's problematic, but just to kind of maybe see if you can, like, according to like other studies say, you know, ask and listen to say like, and you can also reflect back, you know, what I'm hearing is, is that, am I hearing that correctly? And trying, if your goal here is to, you know, kind of grow the awareness of the person who's saying the problematic thing or having the problematic thoughts, sometimes people are saying things out of sheer habit and they haven't really interrogated them even in the slightest. So if you can sometimes even interrupt that default, like, like, I don't know why women dress the way they dress, because obviously they're just bringing it on themselves. You know, it's like, oh, well, that's kind of a, you know, why do you say that? You know, just, it's something to practice, I'll say that, you know, and it doesn't mean it's gonna work great all the time. It may not work for a long time, but I think that would be my suggestion.
I often think that sometimes people don't realize how difficult and damaged things have become. And saying like, well, you know, speaking in a personal experience, a lot of times people also have a tendency to universalize their own personal experience and not recognize that they are coming from a position that has involved a lot of privilege or luck, and that not everybody is as fortunate to have that experience. And so sometimes I have a tendency to point out that like your experience has not been everybody's experience, and that isn't been the case for everybody. And sometimes it's just like, oh, I never considered that not every child has a parent who's able to provide them insurance, like as a young adult. It never occurred to me that they wouldn't have access in that way. And so that can be helpful, but I mean, it can also be really frustrating, and sometimes it's almost like hazing of like, I lived through this terrible experience, I was discriminated against, and so I don't know why we should change it. And that's really hard to see, because you know, want people to be empathetic and make things better. And that's not always the way that it is.
And sometimes we as a society have grown in some ways and other people haven't moved along in the process. So one example I'm thinking of is we had the Women's Fund as our keynote speaker last year was Anita Hill, and she, as many of you know, I guess, you know, when she testified against Clarence Thomas as a Supreme Court Justice, she kind of gave us all language around workplace sexual harassment, but many women felt like, oh, well, that was just something we dealt with as women, right? We had to deal with that in the workplace. And so some women still feel as if, oh, that was just part of the job, and may not have evolved to understand that, yeah, that was still wrong then. And so sometimes it's an evolution of thinking that we have to educate people that, yes, your experience was part of what many people experienced at that time in life, and it's okay to call that out and say, yeah, that what you experienced was awful and traumatic potentially for you, and also we now have language to talk about it, and we try to empower young girls now to recognize that that's not okay and to speak up about it when it happens. And there are all these resources to now flag for young people if it happens on a college campus, if it happens on their job, you know, that they can respond differently than when maybe older women didn't have those resources. So sometimes it could be that you have to take your friend on a journey of awareness and have multiple conversations, starting with what Peggy mentioned, and then kind of continue on.
Thank you, ladies. Really great conversation, and it's funny because you went into my question because it's really about breaking certain cycles and how we do that, and also it takes a generation to do that. What do you feel like our future generation can learn, whether it's from the opera, it's from whatever you're doing today?
I am really encouraged by the youth. I taught a class in the fall that was all first semester college freshmen. And so they are like the youngest students I was going to encounter, because I very much am not interested in teaching high schoolers. And that pushed me through my PhD a few times. Once their eyes were opened to some of the issues of feminism, they started to see it everywhere and kind of think really intersectionally and think really broadly, and organically have conversations with their peers about things. And so I'm really encouraged by that, but I think we have to recognize that this isn't a problem that discrimination and gender inequity is going to die out. We have to be active and make those changes, because systems can perpetuate, and history does in fact have some repetitive bits. So it's not just a progress march that will naturally occur.
But I agree, the young people are amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I am astounded at times when I have conversations with students on campus. Granted, they might end up being like, well, no, it's a range. It's everybody from like our student regent to my students in classes, et cetera, that are so cognizant of things. They have access and have utilized ways to teach themselves things that, I don't even know if I would have thought to teach myself. And they have access to these conversations with their peers, and whether they be in person or online or a combination of them. And so, yeah, I am not saying that, it's definitely not, I agree, it's not some march towards it, it's always better and better, but it's remarkably amazing how much care, passion, and information is out there to disrupt these very oppressive systems and to build and grow the ones that help us reach our potential as human.
And they are not waiting. I mean, these young people are ready for change now, and that's exciting. They've got so much energy.
I was going to say on that too, in other roles and jobs programs we do at Opera Omaha, we work a lot with youth, and it's always a highlight, but also I think that we as adults learn a lot from them. And also we are coming up with a generation that they expect these things. They are not going to sit there and accept the treatment and the behavior that has happened before because that's the way that it is. And to me, that's really exciting. But also when I'm in a classroom and working with youth and middle schoolers, one of our projects is the Poetry and Music Project, where they write poems and then some composers select some of those to turn into songs. But I have the privilege of reading every poem that's submitted, all 135 this year. And what they're saying about their voice and themselves and their world and what they want to see and what they want to change and how that is. And they're saying it out loud because they are submitting this to a project. And all of those poems are going to be out in the world, is so strong and so powerful. And that's how I know we're going to be okay. But I also think that we as adults and the grown-ups in the room have to listen to those voices and to those stories and what they're telling us that they need, and they're telling us the progress that we need to make.
Joe, you had mentioned earlier that it's a network of issues and a system of keeping oppression and keeping a lack of agency. And I know that we often in our world focus on one thing, and that's the thing we rally about and forget about the rest of the net around that. Are there elements that you have seen or have experienced in your work that you feel like ground has been made, that there are places that have been ratcheted it up in creating those support networks that you can then build on other things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've made a lot of progress with our freedom from violence work, which is domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. And in that body of work, we pull together our survivors that we listen to, and so it's survivor-led. So we listen deeply to their experiences, and we learn from them. We pulled together some of the service providers in our community. So this year we're working with 15, 12 of those, which are agencies that we fund. And then we partner with law enforcement, probation, the court system, and all of those agencies in a community of practice. So we work to identify areas in which the system may be failing survivors. And then we work through policy and through working with those partners to make slow and incremental change. But it's difficult work, and we've seen a lot of progress year over year, which is exciting. And we continue to do that work, but we also know that about 50% of survivors in Nebraska choose not to report their assault to law enforcement. So that's the other piece of that they're operating outside of the system. So we're trying now to figure out what other resources and how we can support survivors who choose not to go through that path of accountability in the traditional sense, right? So we've seen a lot of success in terms of the legislature. 2 of our bills were passed last session. One of those was a survivor anonymity bill, which shields the names and addresses of survivors that choose to report their assault so that they have some protection from their abuser for the period of time for law enforcement to investigate the incident. So that helps them connect with an advocate, find a lawyer if they need to, get to a safe place. So that bill was well received and passed near unanimously, so that was really exciting. The other bill we passed was a domestic violence death review team. So at the time, Nebraska was one of 7 states that did not have one of these reviews. So we do, in Nebraska, a maternal death review team. We also have a child death review team, so this is domestic violence death review. So we had some families that came to us and said, you know, our loved one had domestic violence as part of their story, and so they wanted to ensure that there was a process to review cases that had domestic violence. So we now Nebraska's one of those that has that. I think there were 9 cases that had domestic violence that were homicides as of 2022. So now that team is meeting. So we are seeing progress with that body of work, and so that's really promising. Under our sexual health literacy is where we're stalling because there's a lot of political pressure to not teach comprehensive sex ed in our state. And so when you're talking about having an abortion ban, and then you're not teaching about comprehensive sex education, I mean, that's a key component. And for us, it also ties in from an intersectional standpoint to freedom from violence, because you want people to have healthy relationships. And so if you want to prevent domestic violence and sexual assault, you need people to understand how to have a healthy relationship and where those boundaries are. So that's where we've been engaging. There's also a bill in the legislature that would allow medical professionals to determine if they're going to do certain procedures based on their conscience, and if they're going to provide contraception based on their conscience. So that's an issue as well if they're not going to provide basic birth control or emergency contraception. So all of those things are connected. And so it's really a challenging political environment because if you're really trying to prevent abortion, contraception is a piece of that, comprehensive sex education is a piece of that. So,
And I had that experience, speaking of comprehensive sex education. I taught a unit about romance novels in my class on feminism this fall, and students were just really glad to have a space that we could talk about what is a healthy relationship, because feminist romance novels talk a lot about what is a healthy relationship. Surprise, surprise. But they don't, like, almost all my students were from Nebraska and had never had the opportunity to have those conversations. And also feminist romance novels talk about contraception, and because that's important. And so they also had not had those conversations. And so it, hadn't really occurred to them that they had been missing something until it was right in front of their faces. And they were like, oh, this is really refreshing. And this is really important information to have. And I was like, yes, it is. But, that, I guess, is also a problem for postgraduate health sciences education, as my students will tell me. Many of their colleagues haven't ever had comprehensive sex education, and then they're going to be healthcare providers, and it can be quite eye-opening when they get into their classes. And as, person who sees healthcare providers, you would want them to maybe be a little bit more familiar with that before they enter graduate education.
Just a little bit.
Appreciate the conversation. I'd like to bring this down to the middle school and high school level in terms of how we can better teach empowerment and agency for girls, and also to address the adverse childhood events, the ACEs that drive much of the consequences of this behavior. So any suggestions that we can do as a community within our public school system to bring this message down to middle school and high school?
I'm going to start because I have the least to say. There are some amazing after-school programs and education adjacent programs. I actually work in an arts after-school program with Y Arts, but one of the groups that's hired me to come in is Civic Nebraska, and I think that you'd be surprised how many things are like that these little elementary school kids even are getting made aware of in terms of agency, body autonomy, et cetera. And so, age appropriately, So I feel like there are things that are out there in the community, and I think in some ways a lot of them have found like those common human needs that are there so they can work in a kind of restrained system as our state can be with things about like comprehensive sexual education. But I will say it would be well worth anyone who's got a passion or an interest in this to kind of check out what after-school programs do you do, because there are just some amazing ones out there that are teaching kids things that I would have loved to have known when I was like younger in like elementary, middle school, high school.
I think also part of it is just looking at what implicit messages our educators are sending. We know, for example, in STEM education that girls in elementary school score really well in math and science, and then they hit middle school and their test scores plummet. And basically that's when they start getting messages that like math and science is a thing that boys do and not girls do. And that's a problem. And so a lot of times it's our educators or parents or whoever is influential in their lives are kind of passing on these ideas about what it is to, you know, what is appropriate for girls and what's usual and normal for girls. And they probably don't realize it, but sometimes that education can be really eye-opening to recognize what messages are we sending, and how are they picking up on them that we, you know, didn't realize we were doing, is a kind of neutralish way to point out those problems.
I would echo all of what's been said. I would just add that we do have a brand called Access Granted, which is our youth-facing comprehensive sex education and sexual health literacy program. It's geared towards 15 to 24-year-olds, and you can find that on our website. It's free STI testing and treatment, and also free condom distribution, but we do that in partnership with several health clinics across our community. We've been doing that since 2015. And so it has a whole separate social media channel, and you can get information there and also on our website that's youth-led. So you can find Access Granted.
Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for being here and being in that space. I hope that you're taking away from this conversation what I am as well, of just thinking about what are those implicit ways that we're talking about things or thinking about things that we don't know, and how can we change our own language just a little bit to be a little more empowering in that space. I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Joe, Catherine, and Peggy, for this wonderful conversation. I hope that you will come and see Suor Angelica next weekend, the 24th and the 26th of February. I hope you will find me in the lobby and talk about it with me when you're there. And if any of these things that you've heard in this opera and conversation have rung true, we'd also invite you to come back to our After the Curtain opera and conversation on the Tuesday, February 28th, following the performances, for that artist response conversation, where we'd love to hear your thoughts on the opera, how that's impacted you, and maybe if there's anything that sparked for you in a new way or a different way after you've seen the opera. So thank you all again for being here. Stay safe in our snow/winter that we may or may not be getting. Yeah. One more round of applause for our wonderful speakers, and I hope we'll see you at the opera, and I hope we'll see you back here at the Benson Theater on the 28th. Thank you all.
Questa marrassa mia non li si assiderà. Come se addosso mi piovesse in stille, per vendicarmi affoga un faraon. Che fai? Cieli rigi, guarda fumar da mille coniglioli parigi, e pensa a quel patrono vecchio caminetto ingannatore, che vive in ozio come un grande signor. Le sue rendite oneste da pezzo non discende, quelle sciocche foreste che fan sotto la neve. Rodolfo, io voglio dirti un mio pensier profondo, un freddo cane, ed io, Marcel, non ti nascondo che non credo al sudor della fronte. Ho ghiacciate le dita, quasi ancora te ne stimolate, in quella gran ghiacciaia che vuole di musetta. L'amore è un caminetto certo che sciupa troppo e in fretta. Dove l'uomo è faspina e la donna è la lave e una verce non soppio e la